TAPH. By all means, he's the worst survivor in Forsaken. Not to say he's bad, mind you. I'm sure all of us have had the misfortune of being subspaced before, but in comparison to the other survivors, he seems to fall a little short in terms of his usefulness, especially against good killers. But even though he's widely regarded as the worst survivor, we ignored Duzakar, he's still very capable. He's one of the best survivors in the game when it comes to looping, a fact that many people don't seem to be aware of. Sure, he may not have a stun. Sure, he may not be able to distract the killer with a sentry, and sure, his abilities may be defeated by just M1ing as killer. But if you look past his obvious weaknesses, you can see that he's actually really capable. Sure, your traps could just be M1'd, but what if the killer doesn't know where your traps are? Here's an example as to what I mean. I want you to scan this room without pausing, and I want you to see if you can find the subspace mine. Did you find it? Probably not, and you wouldn't have even known that there was a subspace mine right there if it never did its little jingle. But enough of that. Let me actually get into the guide, and to start off, I'm going to explain TAPH's abilities. Now, if you already know all of his abilities, and if you just want to skip to the good stuff, then feel free to skip ahead. And for everyone else who's still here, let me explain TAPH's two traps, starting off with his tripwires. Tripwire is an ability that lets TAPH, well, put down a tripwire. This tripwire, if run over by the killer, will inflict slowness 2 to the killer for 4 seconds, while also revealing the killer's aura for 8 seconds to any survivor within 100 studs of TAPH. Overall, they can be fairly useful to any survivors who are in a chase, as the slowness applied from the tripwire can be used to gain significant distance from the killer, especially if the killer runs over multiple tripwires in one chase. Just be aware that your tripwires are easily broken as they only have 10 HP. Other than the tripwires, TAPH also has his subspace trip mines. When thrown, a subspace trip mine will become somewhat transparent, with the only indication to the killer that it's there being its occasional jingle that plays every 13 seconds. If the killer is unfortunate enough to stand within at least 16 studs of the subspace mine, it'll go off, inflicting the killer with subspace 3 and helpless 1 for 5 seconds if they're within its radius, while also forcing their camera to turn in a random direction. But if the killer hits the mine with any attack, it'll go off regardless of its proximity to the killer, and it'll only apply subspace 1 instead of the usual subspace 3 and helpless. The mine will also go off after 50 seconds regardless of where the killer is. And with his abilities explained, let's talk about something more exciting, that being strategies. As TAPH, you fall under the support category for the survivors. This means that your abilities are to be used to help the team survive and chase without requiring you to directly confront the killer. And as such, you should try placing your traps in commonly traveled spots where a survivor might go during a chase. Now, you have two main ways of setting up your traps. You can either put all of your traps onto one loop spot, or you can space them out across the map. Both of these strategies can work, but it depends heavily on which killer you're up against. To explain further, trapping up a loop spot can be a very effective strategy against specifically Jason and Cool Kid, as they tend to struggle a bit more against looping in comparison to the other killers. And while Cool Kid does have his corrupt nature, you can still position your traps in a way to where he can only break one trap with the ability, forcing him to slowly M1 everything else. And this isn't even mentioning the fact that a tripwire can quite literally block walk speed override for some reason, even though the same doesn't happen to Noli with their Void Rush. And as for Jason, he struggles the most with trapped up loops, as he has nothing to help him in terms of breaking the traps, leaving him with no other choice but to either M1 everything or just brute force his way through to the traps and just hope that the survivors don't gain so much distance from him. However, I wouldn't recommend trapping up loops against 1x, John Doe, and Noli, as all three of them can easily break all of TAPH's traps with one ability. Instead, I'd recommend spreading out your traps across the map in commonly traveled areas such as doorways or entrances. And also, try to at least somewhat conceal your traps. I know that sounds obvious, but I say it regardless because I've seen some TAPHs who put their tripwires out in the middle of a big ass open area only for the trap to be easily broken like a few seconds later. And as for your subspace mine, I'd recommend putting it in corners or close to walls, as the subspace mine can subspace the killer through walls, which can be very helpful in chase. A good map to show the power of subspacing the killer through walls is Horror Hotel. This map has tons of little rooms and doorways, perfect for tripwires. But that's not all. You know that one dark blue room next to the arcade and the kitchen? Well, it turns out that being subspaced in there makes it pretty damn hard to see literally anything, and this room just so happened to be located between two very common loop spots, those being the ball pit and the kitchen table. So in theory, you could put a subspace mine in here against the wall, and if the killer doesn't see it, well, they won't be seeing anything except for a live recreation of what Helen Keller sees on a daily basis. In other words, they won't see jack shit. And that's just on Horror Hotel. There's plenty of spots like that on other maps. To prove this, I'll be giving one good subspace trip mine spot for every single map, starting with Brandon Works. On Brandon Works, you can fit a subspace mine in the light bin next to the ramp, which is especially useful if paired with a guest charge. On Cool Carnival, you have this spot in front front of the cake house, which can't be broken easily unless the killer wastes an ability to do so. On glass houses, you have the spot that I showed in my earlier example, aka behind this little thing in the building with the stairs. On Horror Hotel, you have this spot in the closet in this exact corner, which abuses the fact that subspace mines can inflict their debuffs through walls. Although be aware that the mine must be fully against the corner, otherwise it may not subspace the killer. On Pirate Bay, I have a few spots simply because there's multiple places that make for excellent mine spots. The first one is here in this building inside of the bush. The second one is in this bush next to the killer wall. And the last one is in this corner of this loop spot, as it can subspace the killer if they go up the ramp or if they run too close to the wall. On Planet Voss, you have against this wall next to either of the two killer walls. On the Tempest, you have this spot under the staircase. On Ultimate Assassin Grounds, you have this spot by the bridges in the Slowness Water. For Underground War, you have in this box against the corner. If you get lucky, the killer will be forced to turn from the subspace and they might just fall underground. On Work at a Pizza Place, you have inside this fire pit. And lastly, on York's, you have next to the bridges in the Poison Water. Anyways, let's go to the next part of this guide, that being TAPH's synergies with the other survivors. To be completely honest, TAPH on his own isn't really too great unless you have like 8 TAPHs. In that case, good fucking luck to the killer because the map's about to be more on fire than the Branch Davidians during the Waco Siege in 1993. However, TAPH does synergize really well with a couple other characters, the best example of which being Builderman. If a Builderman and TAPH are working together, they can single-handedly make any loop spot an instant loss for the killer with their sentries and their traps. Other than Builderman, TAPH also has really good synergy with the Sentinels, and not just due to his ability to trap up loop spots. If a Sentinel gets a long stun, such as a chance shooting the killer point blank, you might just have enough time to throw a subspace mine right onto the killer's feet, effectively meaning that you can make the killer unable to do literally anything for upwards of almost 10 seconds. But be aware that you do need to react rather quickly to the killer being stunned, otherwise the killer will get out of stun before the mine goes off. Speaking of the Sentinels, guests can work surprisingly well along with a TAPH if both players know what they're doing. For example, the TAPH can purposely put down an obvious tripwire in a common looping spot, which the killer will then M1. You know which character can benefit greatly from reading a killer's M1? Guest. Another good synergy that TAPH has is with Chance, as TAPH can reveal the killer's aura to Chance, who can then shoot the killer through walls, allowing Chance to stun the killer without any risk of even being seen by the killer. And while the other Sentinels don't really get the same level of synergy as TAPH and Guest, they can still use TAPH's traps to great benefit, as a subspace and slowed killer can make for a very easy target for a Sentinel to stun, especially two-time, who might be hard to see for the killer while subspaced, allowing for easy backstabs. And while speaking of Sentinels, don't be afraid to play close to the killer as TAPH. I'd say TAPH is probably the best support character in terms of their ability in chase, considering how he can throw down subspace mines if he gets enough distance, along with the fact that he has 100 HP, giving him the highest HP pool out of all of the supports. All in all, the point I'm trying to make is that you probably shouldn't play like some TAPHs who just sit in a loop spot all game in their little bird's nest without even trying to help the team. And to conclude this guide, just remember that watching this video won't magically make you a god at TAPH. There's no such thing as a guide that instantly makes you cracked at the game, despite what some people would like to claim. The best advice I can give to you is to just play the game and find out what works and what doesn't. And if that fails, well, you can always just malice farm and play Cool Kid and win for free instead.